Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Story Each Day podcast. This episode is one of my favorite stories from the year. This story is called The Creation Story, and it was one of the last stories I wrote. I wrote it December 15th, 2014. And so it was after almost a whole year of writing these stories each and every single day. So I'm really excited to share it with you and hope you enjoy it. The Creation Story. Written on December 15th, 2014, for A Story Each Day. Far too many creation myths and origin stories claim that some god crafted us out of dirt or clay, or the dust of the earth. I'm not sure why. There's nothing romantic about being made from the ground we walk on, although maybe, at the very least, it's poetic. Maybe we won't feel as bad knowing that we'll end up in the dirt if we believe we came from it. But I harbored a festering skepticism, so I stepped outside on a bright, sunny day when the earth looked most alive and willing to answer, and I asked it, "Where did I come from, Earth? What am I?" I don't know if you've ever asked anything of the ground, but if you have, then you know. It is slow to answer and doesn't like to be bothered. So I waited. Finally, it spoke in a gravelly voice and told me to ask the wind. The wind speaks much more frequently than the earth, but every word fades in and out, and its voice is a faint whisper. So I called out loudly and strained my ears for an answer. Through the leaves and the clouds, I caught a wispy ghost of a voice. It swirled around me, circling me, until it finally swept its sounds together and formed words that I could understand. "Ask the sun," it whispered to me. "The sky knows." I pulled my coat over my shoulders against the wind and climbed a nearby hill. The sun shone brightly, and as I reached the peak of the hill, I screamed, loud and brilliant. "What am I, sun? Where did I come from?" But the sun just laughed, a warm, comforting laugh. No cynicism tainted its mirth, but it wove no answer into its chorus of sunshine either. "Ask the moon," it said, and then slowly sank into the horizon, like a child playing hide and seek. I sat on the hill, on a bed of grass, and waited for the moon to arrive. It curled into the sky, a sharp crescent with a silver smile that beckoned my questions. "Where did I come from, moon? Do you know?" The moon's jovial mime left me unsure that I would ever receive an answer, or that it would do anything other than smile at me silently. Finally, when it reached the middle of the sky, the moon grinned and said, "The ocean knows, my friend. The ocean knows almost everything." I shrugged and watched the moon fade from the night sky, dodging and dancing behind clouds as it went. When the sun finally reappeared, laughing warmly, I stood and walked to the shore. The ocean wasn't far, a 30-minute walk from the city. The seaside drew a reserved serenity that had nested in my soul, hidden for far too long. I walked up to the ocean and stepped barefoot into the waves. Before I could ask, it knew what I was there for. "Why are you worried about where you came from?" it asked me, waves rumbling back and forth. "What else would I be worried about?" I whispered. The ocean laughed and crashed. More waves lapped up against the miles of sand. You're more than just you. You're made up of tiny little things, all put together to make something else, aren't you? You're not one thing, even though you act like it. You're just a tiny little bit, made up of other tiny little bits. I shut my eyes, and the sound of the waves crashing suddenly became the sound of traffic racing past. The traffic faded and became ocean once again. I opened my eyes, and the ocean continued. All of you humans just blend together. I can hardly see any difference between you. So don't be concerned with where you came from, because the pieces that made you came from everywhere. I thought about that for a while. There was something poetic about it, but maybe not as poetic as being made of dust and returning to it in the end. The ocean's abstract meanderings sounded nice, but they clanked against my mind. I turned away, and my eyes set on the city in the distance. I couldn't argue with the ocean. Everything around me was just something smaller. Thousands of tiny parts bonded together to form a whole. Millions and millions of grains of sand formed miles and miles of beach, which in turn formed the structure of the continent. Millions of blades of grass all wove together until they formed the cushioning blanket for the earth to wrap itself in. I turned back to the ocean. You're not one thing either, I challenged it. The ocean just crashed and lapped at me, but I continued. You don't believe me, do you? I said. What about the raindrops? What would you be without them? The waves continued, but the ocean didn't respond. The ocean was no doubt shocked and surprised to realize that it was made of nothing more than millions of water droplets, just as I was hesitant to accept the composite of my own existence. I turned away from the sea and walked back to the city, meshing into the vast network of streets and cars and people and sidewalks. Yes, the ocean was stunned, but have no doubt, the droplets were far more surprised to find that they formed an ocean than the ocean was to find that it was only made of rain. Around the time when I wrote this story, I had a couple of friends who were really interested in this concept of Gestalt. Gestalt is a term used in psychology, and I learned it in design school, and it's summarized by the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The idea that when you get several different things together in a system, sometimes the way they interact can actually create something more than just the sum of those things. A good example might be a bicycle. When you take all the different parts of a bicycle and put them together, it creates something more than just the parts of the bicycle. It creates this entire system. So it's not just something embedded in the individual parts of a bicycle. It's the relationship of the parts to each other that actually creates the meaningful interaction there. So this story is just a reflection on what that concept would look like if you applied it to humanity and to a person, and how we can extrapolate meaning not just in and of ourselves, which is a very sort of Western individualistic mindset that we have in the U.S. right now, but also how can we find meaning, and how can we think about meaning as a result of the way we build relationships with each other. So this story starts out with a very sort of poetic narrative, this narrator talking to different elements in the world. He talks to the earth, he talks to the moon, he talks to the sun, and then finally the ocean. And I think the reason it's important that the main character interacts with these elements is because we interact with them every single day. We interact with the sun, we interact with the moon, we interact with the soil, we interact with water. And water can be broken down into these tiny little droplets or a glass, or it can form an entire ocean. But you definitely see the concept of Gestalt in the ocean, because it's not just individual droplets that have the meaning, it's the fact that they're all together, and they come together and form the ocean. So overall, this is one of the stories that I'm very, very pleased with, because it does mesh sort of this cerebral idea of Gestalts with the poetic language of the narrator talking and wrestling with these elements. But at the same time, there are definitely some things I would change about this story. I'll give you an example, actually. In the very first line of this story, it says, "Far too many creation myths and origin stories claim that some god crafted us out of dirt or clay or the dust of the earth." Now, if I was rewriting this sentence, I think I would make it a little bit more concise. I think that the repetition of creation myths and origin stories is maybe too much, so maybe I could just combine them, or and say creation stories or origin myths, although that doesn't actually have the best ring to it. But yeah, I could say something instead of saying both of them, just shorten it down, make it more concise, and that would add some clarity to the sentence. I also think that saying some god crafted us out of dirt or clay or dust of the earth, all of those things are pretty similar, and I think they all are accomplishing sort of the same thing, and it's not entirely necessary that I have all of those in the sentence. It creates an overly wordy sentence, and I think the sentence would probably sound better. This is just me editing on the fly, but probably sound better if I had rewritten it and said, "Far too many creation stories claim that some god crafted us out of the dust of the earth." It's more concise, it's more clear, and it gets closer to the point of what I'm saying in a faster and more efficient way, which makes it more meaningful and more poignant in the minds of the reader, typically. It's always good to learn from the things that you create. It's always good to learn from your stories, to enjoy them, but also look back on them and recognize how you've improved or how you could improve in the future. And so I try to do that through this exercise of reading these stories, but also sharing them with you. I hope that you enjoyed this story, and I hope that you all will tune in next week for another story. Thanks so much for listening. A Story Each Day was written by me, Nicholas Voyta Sailer. Music in this episode by Blue Dot Sessions and David Seste. You can read more of these stories, purchase the collection, or subscribe to hear updates about my upcoming novel by going to astoryeachday.com. Thanks for listening.